Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is David Warrick, Executive Vice President at Overhaul. David, thank you so much for joining me.
It's great to be back. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course, and you and I first spoke the day after what President Trump dubbed as Liberation Day, where he unveiled his sweeping tariff policy. And when you and I had that conversation, you said you were in shock. The tariffs were way more broad ranging than anticipated. So now, as we sit here 2 months to the day from Liberation Day, I'm curious what your experience has been like on this tariff roller coaster, which we will get into. And more importantly, to start off the conversation, has that shock worn off?
I think that the initial shock has definitely worn off. And I think it's been a very interesting 8 weeks. When we last spoke, I did say, what advice, you asked me what advice was I giving the companies at the time. And my advice was hurry up and wait and be prepared to act quickly. Now, I don't like to say that I'm always right, but in this instance, I actually was right. It was if you'd made a decision on any given day over the last 8 weeks, there's a fair chance that you would have to have rolled back that decision nearly immediately. And so, from a supply chain perspective, this ongoing turmoil is interesting and it is challenging in terms of what is going to happen next. And right up until Friday, we even thought it was starting to calm down a little bit. We thought there's negotiations happening with China, and then suddenly steel and aluminium come back on the agenda on a speech from the president on Friday evening and doubling the tariffs on those.
And I watched our conversation back from early April, and you were right on a bunch of things. So, A, give yourself a pat on the back. But B, your advice was hurry up and wait, but be prepared to act quickly. And I actually wrote that down because I'm curious if that's the advice you would give in light of the court rulings regarding the tariffs. Because last week, the U.S. Court of International Trade ruled against President Trump's tariffs. They called them unlawful. He exceeded his authority in doing that. And less than 24 hours later, an appeals court ruled that the tariffs can stay in effect for now. So what's your advice to the business community? Hurry up and wait, but be prepared to act quickly. What does that look like?
My advice has not changed because I think that this is still such a complex set of activities that have to happen. I do not doubt that the White House are working, very quickly to try and sign agreements, trade agreements with a lot of countries around the world. But we haven't really seen a lot of progress. We hear a lot about the conversations, but we haven't seen real factual progress. That has to happen. The 90 days that the president initially talked about, we're getting close to the end of that 90 days. Listening to the commentary from Besant and from Lutnick, they're saying, okay, we're in these negotiations, but I read an article this morning which said that to a certain extent, a lot of what happens next depends on what is agreed with China. And that's an interesting perspective because it means, it's not just supply chains are saying hurry up and wait. The global economy is to a certain extent saying, let's see what happens with China. And that may well set the precedent for what happens with everybody else. And that's perfectly fine, but we just need it to happen. We need something to be on paper so that we can all now step forward.
And let's start with what exactly is happening with China because last month, China and the United States came to a temporary agreement for 90 days where they majorly rolled back the tariffs. But this relationship is seemingly falling apart over the past couple of days because I want to read what President Trump said over the weekend. He claimed that China, quote, has totally violated its agreement with the US. And China rejected wholeheartedly that allegation. And China's Commerce Ministry said that the actions from the United States, quote, seriously undermine the existing consensus reached at the Geneva Economic and Trade Talks and seriously damage China's legitimate rights and interests. What do you make of where we are right now in the trade negotiations with the United States and China?
I really do hope that this is some active positioning. And, I think a number of very senior, members of the cabinet have said it's really going to require a conversation between the two leaders. And if that conversation can happen, and again, there's speculation that could be this week, if that conversation happens, I firmly believe that it will allow us to get over this current impasse and move forward. But that depends on the two most senior leaders probably in the world being able to come together and have a conversation and really push the agenda forward. So in this current phase, to be honest, I don't depend on anything happening as it should, but I always am very hopeful that common sense will prevail and that conversation will happen and we'll move on.
And so I know you said that all eyes are on China, and then people can figure out their next steps depending on what that negotiation, what that deal looks like. I mean, what do you think? What are some indications of what that deal looks like before people make their next moves? I mean, what should people be looking out for?
I mean, I think people should be looking out for, what does the final result look like? So this is a very interesting, psychological test. So there was no tariffs, or there was 20% tariffs. Suddenly that became 145%. Then it reverts back to 30%. And we all celebrate. But if you think about it, we're actually still in a worse position than where we started. So from a pure, if I told you, hey, this thing that if you were going to buy this particular item in February, and then I told you it was going to be 145% more expensive, and now after through all of the different conversations, it's still going to end up 30% more expensive. You kind of look at that and going, okay, that's really interesting in terms of the cycle that we've been through. So what does success look like? A good outcome looks like a fair balance of trade for all countries around the world. It is our ability to be able to streamline and optimize the supply chain to accommodate all of that. And it really is the stop of these knee jerk reactions. I mean, one of the indicators that supply chain professionals look for are, the shipping rates coming from China. How much does it cost to ship a container from one of the southern Chinese ports into Long Beach or into, the port of Seattle? And those rates have been fluctuating madly over the last 6 weeks as the different decision points happen. Supply chains work best when there's some level of stability. So how do we get to that level of stability? I'm not a politician. I can't tell you how those conversations need to work, but I do believe that it's better for everyone if we can get to an agreement.
And then I'm curious how you think that the court rulings impact all of this. Do you think multiple federal courts ruling that the tariffs that President Trump imposed largely are unlawful, do you think that gives other countries more negotiating power? I mean, what do you think that really does to the ongoing negotiations?
I think it was super interesting, and we probably weren't paying enough attention to this smaller court, who actually had this ability to make this powerful decision. What does it mean? It means that we are still in flux. So again, there's been countless articles, news articles over the weekend to say, look, this is not the only way that tariffs can be imposed. There's different capabilities that the president has to be able to impose tariffs, at a greater level. And so, I look at this and say, okay, I think that this is due process, right? The courts have now had their opinion. That opinion was appealed. It will be appealed again. We'll go to a higher court. Hopefully, it doesn't end up in the Supreme Court, but it looks like it might have to end up there. And then that will set some guardrails. Am I hopeful that those will all be very positive? I'm very positive that we will get to a good place, but I worry a little bit about what that means. I worry a little bit about what does that outcome actually look like. And yet again, when you think about what happened on Wednesday and Thursday of last week, the tariffs were on, then suddenly the tariffs were illegal and they were all off. And then the next day they were back on again. For small businesses, for even for big businesses and for supply chain practitioners, really tough to navigate this current turmoil to try and make the best possible decisions.
I mean, that's a really good point. What does this mean? Because I was actually in an interview, in a conversation, talking about the tariffs last week when they were off, and then the appeals court ruled they were on for now until June 9th. So, what does that mean, do you think, for small businesses and the supply chain? Because In that 24-hour period when the tariffs were ruled deemed unlawful, they were struck down. The Trump administration said that they were on the cusp of 3 trade deals and many more are on the way. Now we know the tariffs are in effect until at least June 9th, but what does this all mean for the global supply chain?
For the global supply chain it's still a little bit in crisis, and what we're trying to figure out is what is the longer term. So it's really interesting that the economic data that you're seeing over the last week has not been massively affected by tariffs. Now there's lots of different connotations there in terms of, is that just a timing issue, or is there something else? But in general, global supply chains are starting to go from thinking short term to thinking medium term and thinking long term. Okay, the tariffs are going to be there in some shape or form. How do we start making decisions to enable the constant flow of goods? That is where we can't sit on the edge of our seat every single day waiting for the next decision to be implemented and then revoked. So we have to start taking a slightly longer term view on supply chain and on the economy. And what does that mean? It means getting rid of the fragility, starting to think more about resilience. But that takes time. You don't just onshore manufacturing tomorrow. You don't just change a country as an origin in terms of where you manufacture with the flick of a switch. These things take time, and supply chains now have to start to become more thoughtful and also spending more time with technology. So there's a technology element of this, which is having understanding and visibility and transparency of what's in your supply chain is really important right now to allow you to make better decisions going forward. So companies are starting to actually pay more attention to that. Even in this space of 8 weeks, companies have started to pay more attention to, are we really understanding our data? How do we enable ourselves to move quickly? We have to have transparency in our supply chains. We have to understand what we're deciding, what decisions we're making on what inventory, and what that cost impact is going to be.
And companies, I feel like, have layers upon layers now of this uncertainty that they have to kind of juggle with. Hey, we're looking at negotiations and we're seeing how that's going. Hey, we know that President Trump really on a dime can pause, stop, threaten tariffs really on any country he wants. And that's what he's been doing for now. Plus, on top of this legal battle of, are the tariffs unlawful? Are they not? And as you said, there are other ways President Trump can impose tariffs. So even if this is deemed unlawful, he can go about it another way. So do you think, or are there certain industries rather that are more vulnerable right now than other ones?
I mean, I think that obviously anybody who is very dependent on manufacturing in China has really been feeling the pain and has been going through a lot of challenge. Um, at the same time, I do feel that the small businesses are going to feel the biggest impact, and this is across the board. In food and beverage, for example, the small business community just don't have the same buying power. And there's countless examples of, small wine importers, toy importers, clothing, apparel importers. There's numerous stories of, great entrepreneurial ideas have put together, small businesses, and suddenly their prices over the last 8 weeks have doubled, tripled, or gone, just completely to a level where they're not going to be able to produce. And this is, buying raw materials, even to bring those into the US to be able to finish them. And there's countless small businesses are being impacted. It's really hard for them because they don't have the financial wherewithal to be able to, do too much of the hurry up and wait. They don't stockpile. They're not able to stockpile inventory, and they're going to be susceptible to whatever the price point is on any given day. That's where we're already starting to see some pain, and that is going to continue until we get some level of balance in these trade negotiations.
And I think something we've seen really in the past 2 months is that President Trump isn't just changing and slightly tinkering with trade agreements with a few countries. I mean, he is completely uprooting global trade as we know it. So, from that lens, do you think this changes what small businesses and the small business community looks like forever?
I think it's definitely a shock. I think it is, the equivalent of we would call it a gray swan event. But, small businesses grow up through immense creativity. And, I was having a conversation around, restaurants and how the restaurant business, could be impacted. And it really goes to, okay, there's going to be a higher price potentially for certain goods being brought in from Mexico or from Canada. How does a small business like a restaurant, a family owned restaurant, how do they cope? Well, they now have to think about different things. It may be you have to create different menu options. Maybe you have to create another unique identifier in terms of your customer service. So there's different ways that small businesses have to think. They have to adapt. They have to change. And that, while maybe unfortunate, that's how they were created in the first place. They saw a need and they were doing something to be able to actually supply and delight customers with that need. So I think in the natural evolution, more of that will happen. They will go down that same path, only this time it's been because of a forced change. So I do not in any way doubt the creativity and the innovation that is available in the small business community. Now it's being put to the test yet again, to be able to this time survive.
And I'm curious, I want to get your reaction to this because we saw this a lot in President Trump's tariff policy that he threatens a major tariff move and then he rolls it back. He gets the country, whoever it is, to the negotiating table or on a phone call, and then he says, you know what, I'm going to pause this. We saw that most recently with the EU. And Wall Street analysts reportedly call his on again and off again moves taco trade. Trump always chickens out. So I'm curious, is that how companies, is that how supply chains are viewing him? And do they implement that into their strategy of, hey, President Trump might chicken out on this, that might not be the number, and we should plan accordingly?
I think that what we've learned over the last 8 to 12 weeks has been that change is always a constant, and so to my earlier point, making strategic decisions, making strategic bets based on any one news article or any one tweet just doesn't seem like a really good idea right now. I read the situation as it is open to daily disruption. It is open to daily change. And therefore, that is how you have to absorb it, and that's how you have to accommodate it. You can complain about it, but it's that is our new norm. So embrace it and figure out a way to make your supply chains more resilient and more adaptable, knowing that this is going to continue for some period of time.
And I guess my question to you then is, I mean, if I'm a business owner, if I am in charge of a company, I'm ripping my hair out thinking that this is how I have to go day by day. A tweet can totally upend my business or upend how I need to look at a certain sector of my business. So I was speaking with the Secretary General of the ICC last week, and he said that, a lot of this tariff policy is written in pencil now, not pen. So until all of these negotiations are written in pen and not pencil, until the tariff policies really are nailed down, I mean, what should businesses be doing?
They should be hurry up. They should be applying the logic of hurry up and wait, because they can't do anything else. So make the most of what you possibly can. Even for the bigger manufacturers right now, as the initial tariffs happened with China, the first thing they did was not to panic and move production. They had already created some level of decentralization from the very first wave of tariffs back in 2018. So what they did in the short term was they ramped up production in those other factories, which could have been in the Philippines or Malaysia or Thailand. They actually had the opportunity to say, we created a level of resilience. Let's double down on that in the short term while we figure out what's going to happen next. And so, from a small business perspective, it's the same thing. It's, what are your strategies that are working? What are your strategies that are helping you right now? Those are the ones that you double down on while you wait for the next iteration of the tariff discussion and the global trade discussion. Because the one thing that we know for sure is that it's going to change. We just don't know where it's going to end up just yet.
I know we don't know where it's going to end up, but do we know when it's going to be ending up? Because, as you said, I mean, the 30 days from the Liberation Day after President Trump temporarily paused those reciprocal tariffs, that's coming up soon. We're in the same calendar month as when that date is, the deadline is here. So, when that happens, I mean, what are you looking out for?
I think what's going to happen is, and again, I may be a little bit speculative here, but I think what's going to happen is the deadlines are pencil deadlines. They are okay. That's where we're aiming for. But if we're making great progress, we'll move that date out. And I think that's what we really saw with the European Union last week. It was there's a fixed timeline that was to force the conversation. A conversation happened. The deadline moved out. And again, the next set of conversations will happen. And if those are getting close, the deadline will move out again. That's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just the way that it is. These are complex negotiations. They're not going to be signed quickly. And I think that there's a lot of commentary to say that even the 90 days may not be enough. So my perspective is common sense will prevail as we get closer to these deadlines. It's not going to be a complete shutdown. It's going to be a now we've got to this step of the process. Now we're going to continue the conversation on in the hope that we'll get to that point. Now, for everybody's sake, I really do hope, Brittany, I hope it's sooner rather than later, but we don't know. And I think that we've been through 3 months of turmoil. Everybody's getting a little bit, jaded with the ongoing changes and the discussions, but we all hope that it's leading to a better place and that happens relatively in the short term.
And to your point, they're complex negotiations, and there's dozens of them happening at once, and dozens of agreements that need to be nailed down. But as a supply chain expert, what do you think is missing really from the international dialogue, even from this conversation, when it comes to what we've seen on the tariff roller coaster in the past 3 months?
I think that the knock-on impact is that we've seen certainly through supply chain, but also in the business. It causes a level of disruption, and 3 or 4 weeks ago, before the president, before the talks in Geneva that wind the tariffs back a little bit, there was real concern in the logistics community because the major ports were starting to go dry. We were starting to see a real slowdown in the amount of shipping that coming in, and there's a huge population that is dependent on those ports. So the drayage drivers, the lorry drivers, the warehouse workers, that's a lot of people who are suddenly now wondering, is my job safe? Am I going to have work? Am I going to be able to pay my bills? And so those things are, it's when you think about the high level, we've got to do a better job in terms of how the United States is positioned in the global trade arena. But this actually goes right down to individuals, on the ground. And whenever, if you think about the number of owner operator, lorry drivers in the US, it's a huge population. And suddenly, if there's not enough, inbound cargo, there's no work. And whenever there's no work, they still have to pay their bills. So do they find something else to do? And if they do that, then is there enough to bring them back? This is the COVID problem all over. So many people left the industry during COVID, found other opportunities, but then they didn't return whenever the COVID restrictions went away. And suddenly there's a shortage of lorry drivers, there's a shortage of warehouse workers, there's a shortage of dock workers, which further complicates the supply chain and makes it harder. So I think that while these negotiations are happening, and it's right for the world trade, to make sure that we're doing the right thing for all of the countries. But let's not forget that we're also impacting people's lives while we're in these discussions. And anything we can do to speed those along and get to a conclusion is just good for the economy, it's good for the country, and it's good for the people.
I think that's a great point, especially. And I'm really grateful for your time today. And I'm grateful for the conversation and really the pulse check of where we are 2 months to the day after Liberation Day. David Warrick, thank you so much for joining me. You are welcome back anytime. And I hope I can lean on your insights as we see where these tariff negotiations go.
I look forward to talking about the conclusion in a couple of weeks, maybe.
Fingers crossed. Have a good one.
Thank you.